The PRovoke Podcast, brought to you by PRovoke Media and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers. Hello everyone and welcome to the PRovoke Media Podcast. This is Arun Sudhaman in Hong Kong, and I'm very happy to be joined this Monday morning by Richard Brett, who's CEO of Ogilvy PR and Ogilvy Health in Australia. Richard, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm very good, thank you. Great to be able to join you this Monday morning.
Yeah, or it may even be Monday afternoon, I suppose.
Yes, it's just Monday afternoon here in Sydney, yeah.
Cool, excellent. So thanks a lot for your time. Before we get started, I just wanted to ask you, actually, because I'm not sure if we've had you on the podcast before. I think this may be your PRovoke Media podcast debut. How long have you been in Australia now?
Yes, longer than I dare to admit, 9 years now, which is crazy. Yeah, so when I came here, I thought I'd maybe do 3 or 4 years. But yeah, I've actually been here, it'll be 9 years in October.
That's crazy, because I remember meeting you in London before you moved to Australia.
Yeah, that's right, exactly.
Okay, all right. Well, great. Well, it's good to hear. I mean, it seems like you've done really well there. Obviously, you're now in charge of everything at Ogilvy, Ogilvy PR and Ogilvy Health.
Yeah. So me and myself and Sally Kassane, they sort of brought us together more last year under Ogilvy. So it's great to be able to build a much more kind of integrated offer for our clients here. And also I love Australia. It's a great place to be.
Yeah, well, that helps too. So we're going to talk about Ogilvy PR's Futures Report. So just for the benefit of our listeners, this is a report you've kind of been doing regularly, but is this the first time you've done it since the pandemic hit?
Yeah, well, we I think, as you know, before the pandemic, we would do them every year. So it was sort of a summary of all the big technological and creative conferences like South by Southwest and Cannes Lions. But, it really felt that it needed our team to be at the conferences. So yeah, we sort of paused them during the pandemic. We did some sort of special ones. So we did one looking at the future of health care marketing. We did a special on the PR industry, the future of the PR industry, and one on the future of content marketing. But yeah, this is the first time where we've sort of assembled content from the big conferences and put it into an annual report since 2019.
Wow, okay. But luckily not much has changed since 2019 in terms of the world at large, right? So I guess in terms of what you have seen over the last, I suppose, the 3 years since the last report, and given the fact that, we have had this a pandemic, which some countries are still emerging from, would you say you were surprised by the findings that came out in the latest edition of the report?
I don't think I was surprised. I think, we're seeing a continuation of many of the themes that we are all aware of. I think one of the headlines from the report we did in 2019 and the report this year is still purpose-led marketing. That's not new news. And Cannes especially was full of purpose-led campaigns. So we've tried to really look at, well, within purpose, what is changing. And I think that the big headline probably, and the pandemic has probably accelerated that, is, the emergence of how social media and new platforms are connecting us, and how they are monetizing creativity as well. So that's really the sort of the headline is how we're sort of seeing this new shift from, control messages and brands and organizations, pushing out content and messages to audiences, to a real sense of collaboration, or alchemy, as the report's title suggests, and
Mhm.
conversation where organizations are really allowing fans, consumers, creatives to play around with and be inspired and facilitate content for them to actually create on their behalf, which was happening
Mhm.
before, but we've already seen this accelerate, and there's been a real sort of drive to the monetization of that as well. So
Mhm.
new platforms like Patreon, for example, are really taking off and allowing people to begin to reap financial benefits from creating for brands.
Right. Um, the report looks at 10 trends across 4 chapters. So altruism is one, as you mentioned, that's trends in purpose. Authors, which is also, as you mentioned, looks at co-creation, the acceleration there. Avatars, so that's adventures in identity, and altered authority, which focuses on re-empowering democracy. So we talk about co-creation first because as you've described it as the headline. Um, it's not something, I don't think you'd say it's something that's kind of brand new within
No.
this whole PR and marketing world. Do you think, or perhaps if I put it this way, what factors from the last perhaps 2 to 3 years do you think have accelerated that shift towards co-creation? And how much of that do you think is down to I suppose, the changes we've seen because of the way people are living and working now?
Mm. You're right. I mean, I think it was happening, this is a trend that was happening before the pandemic, and it's hard, I think, to clearly say how the pandemic has had an impact, but I think, as we've all observed and talked about, the pandemic has certainly accelerated a shift towards how we're connecting digitally, obviously through work, but I think it's also
Mm,
accelerated the shift to people consuming content through their devices. And obviously, there are other things that have happened as well. The
yeah.
arrival of TikTok, was that accelerated by the pandemic? Really hard to say. We don't really know,
Mm,
but I think we are seeing, and what we've tried to articulate in the report is how the attitude of brand holders and stakeholders
mm,
seems much more open to
mm,
collaborating with and seeing the input of fans and other creators, and sort of almost relaxing control
mm,
and letting and embracing the fact that people are creating all this really interesting and highly engaging content about their organization in ways that they would never have thought of, and that's what people want.
mm,
So that
mm.
we think is a real shift that has, was perhaps happening before, but has certainly accelerated in the last few years.
It's very interesting because for a long time we've heard that brands have got to get better at giving up control um, if they hope to kind of create more authentic connections or relationships with people, let's say. But that's been really difficult, I think, for many companies, many brands to do effectively. Why do you think they are more relaxed about it now, given that there's still a lot of risks involved, I would imagine, when it comes to giving up control of the brand across all of these various online platforms?
Yeah, there are definite risks. I mean, I think there's two things that have changed. I think there are more really good examples where brands have relaxed control and embraced it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's given confidence for other brand holders to say, okay, let's try this and see what happens. I think, secondly, there's been a real shift of people to engaging with content not that is not created by the brand, but is created by other people talking about the brand. And I think people are seeing that
Mm,
is actually what people are engaging with.
mm,
Um, and I think that there is now more of a motivation for creators to create content
mm,
because they can monetize it now as well.
yeah.
So I
Right.
think they're the things that are shifting,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
allowing people to perhaps feel more confident about this new paradigm in creativity.
And any brands in particular that you point to as examples of those that are doing a particularly good job in this area?
Well, I think one of the classic examples I think was the Draw Ketchup campaign from Heinz, where they
Mm-hmm.
simply asked the internet to draw ketchup, and every single person, apart from one guy who drew a mustard bottle for some reason, drew essentially a Heinz shaped red classic ketchup bottle. And then they did a really interesting piece of content with AI where they asked AI to draw ketchup in the style of famous artistic styles as well, which was really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the Skittles lime campaign, where they sort of went out and actually apologized for removing lime, and did a whole sort of um, ironic press conference, and then an apology to I think the 135,000 people that had complained online about the removal of lime, and made a whole campaign about that. So sort of embraced their mistake, which I think
Mm-hmm.
ties into something that we talked about. We talked about this trend called flawsome back in 2019, where we were seeing leaders and brands embrace where they've made mistakes or got things wrong,
Mm-hmm.
and this sort of, I think, desire away from kind of spin and Teflon coated leadership to be much more kind of humble and authentic, kind of ties into this shift,
Mm-hmm.
as well.
Yeah. You talked about the emergence of new platforms and, in particular, the ability to monetize more effectively. And you mentioned
Mm.
Patreon, but presumably you're also talking about, for example, the metaverse and the use of NFTs. Is that something that you're increasingly seeing?
Yeah, so in the report, we talk about a trend called the Me in Metaverse, which is, obviously we're all talking about the metaverse and the opportunities that is allowing us. So we wanted to look at something slightly different within there. And I think one of the things that struck the team who went to Cannes this year was about how people are expressing themselves in very different and interesting and new ways on the metaverse. So it's this idea that you can really be whoever you want to be. And there was a number of talks from about how Gen Z are sort of going into the metaverse as very different personalities and very different people. And the fashion world is really embracing that self-expression. And they seem to be the industry that is perhaps seemingly to having the most, or perhaps the first set of interesting financial rewards and benefits from playing in the metaverse, commercially. And then and we're seeing lots of interesting new ways that people are monetizing this creation. So NFTs obviously being a good example. We talk about how the Chainsmokers, with their new album, created an NFT for their superfans as well, that was available um, with the album. And then we talked about, I think, because of Patreon, how other platforms, such as YouTube, Spotify, TikTok, are re-looking at and changing and giving more money back to creators for content that is gaining traction as well. So there's been a real shift, not massive, but there's certainly a shift towards how these platforms can actually reward the people that are creating interesting content, um, on the platforms as well.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I mean, in general, how far along would you say brands are? Because especially with the metaverse and NFTs, there does seem to be concern around whether it's being overhyped. When you look at your own client base, for example, would you say it's something usage is widespread now, or is it still you're still at a kind of educational phase, and I suppose how far do you think we're going to get with it all?
Yeah, it's a great question. Excuse me, I'll start again. That's a great question. I think our general advice is depends on the industry that
Mm,
you're in. So certainly for gaming, it's, you know, a real advice is absolutely jump in.
yeah.
Um, I think the second industry where we're seeing a lot of traction, as I said, is fashion. So we are seeing
Mm,
the real traction around the monetization of the metaverse for fashion brands. But I think depending on who you are, I think our advice would be we're still in early days, and I think it feels in many ways a little bit like the early days of the iPhone, where suddenly there was this new almost infrastructure, and we didn't quite know the app economy that would
mm,
follow. It feels a little bit like
mm,
that we don't quite know what's possible and the way that it's going to go
mm,
yet. But there will be, I think, lots of really, really interesting, you know, possibilities for organizations to build and explore and monetize what they do on the
mm,
metaverse. Um, but yeah, I think it depends on the industry that you're in, and I think for certainly for many clients, it's more of a watch, wait, and
mm.
see. For others, depending on the industry, yes, jump in and begin
Yeah.
exploring.
And when it comes to avatars, um, one of the things that I think is quite interesting there is that, so in your reports described as adventures in identity, do you see any risks there around authenticity, for example? Because we've always been told, I suppose, that companies have to be authentic and genuine and honest and credible. But now we seem to be entering into an era when there are so many possibilities in terms of who someone can be online, and what they can say and what
Mm.
they can, how they can identify and many manners. Do you see any risks around that when it comes to brand authenticity?
Definitely. I mean, I think where we're seeing, I think that the opportunities and risks are around how you can really add value and a genuinely interesting experience or piece of content on the
Mm-hmm.
metaverse. And I think, the danger is that brands could, for example, just set up a store um, in the metaverse, but it doesn't really add anything new or
Mm-hmm.
interesting to people's
Yeah.
experiences. So, it's you've got to avoid just doing the same thing that you're doing in the physical world. You've got to create something that is, different, useful, interesting, gives people joy, whatever it might
Mm,
be, but is different to the physical world.
yeah. Um, and then the final chapter in the report looks at altered authority. So a new role for brands and organizations as governments struggle with increasingly complex problems. Um, and that's something again that we have seen, I think, taking shape for a number of years now. Again, how
Mm.
ready do you think companies are for this kind of a role?
I think that there have been a number of things that have happened in the past few years, and this set of trends is sort of powered by huge, you know,
Mm-hmm.
social forces um, that are really outside any CMO or CCO or even CEO's
Mm,
control. Um, one of the trends is explores how government, primarily the US government, has actually been very successful in tackling fake
mm,
news around the war in
yeah.
Ukraine. And we sort of explore the Cool Russia campaign as a really interesting example of how people are fighting back against autocratic misinformation, where essentially hundreds of thousands of real Russians were phoned by volunteers to tell them what was really happening in the war in Ukraine. So we're seeing, I think, this sense of people feeling empowered to take on these problems themselves against this backdrop of huge, economic, climatic challenges, political challenges that the world is seeing. And I think we're also seeing increasingly perhaps where brands wanted to avoid picking sides on a political debate, either choosing to pick sides or being forced to pick sides. And the case of Disney in Florida perhaps was a tipping point where I think the management of Disney wanted to avoid getting into the don't say gay bill debate, but because of pressure from their employees, they decided to take a stand. Is being one example of that. And another example I think that we've seen, that we talk about there's a trend that we call powers the me, which really looks at how organizations, people, brands are learning from political campaigns to stand up for things that they don't believe are right. And the Morning After Ireland, I think, is a great example of that, where an organization found a way to really make a dramatic point about access to emergency contraception and managed to then create political debate around this issue, where they basically built a small, essentially platform in international waters off the coast of Honduras, and then people went out to take the medication there, but it created a national debate and conversation. So I think we're seeing creativity used in really interesting ways to change law. There's a trend in the report called Standing in Opposition, which is all about how organizations are choosing to tackle issues, to pick a side and drive change, perhaps being more political and more controversial than they would have done perhaps a few years ago. So why that is happening, I think there's obviously, especially in the US, increasingly sort of polarized political discourse that is perhaps making company and organizational leaders that they can't really stand on the sides anymore, and they need to choose where they stand, and make a point and do what they can to try and change things that whether they're target audiences, consumers, or in the case of Disney, their employees believe they have to do something.
Yeah, so this whole idea, which existed for a long time, I think, that companies should just not get involved in politics. Do you think that just doesn't apply anymore? It's too risky to not say anything.
I think it increasingly is a position where companies can't not take a stand. And I think it's really being driven by the generational shift. If you look at the data for Gen Z and millennials, they passionately believe in diversity and inclusion. They're extremely worried about the state of the environment and the climate crisis. And they want organizations with purpose that are going to stand up and make those changes. And in many countries around the world where there is huge tightness of labor markets, employees expect organizations to be doing things to make the world a better place. So Again, it doesn't apply to every organisation in every market, but I think increasingly, yes, we are going to see organisations having to do things that their employees believe in, and fight for change.
Yeah, very interesting, and opens up a lot of possibilities, I suppose, for the public relations industry. Richard, thank you so much for your time today. The report is called Alchemy, Avatars, and Altered Authority, and it can be found on Ogilvy PR Australia's website. And I definitely recommend reading it because there's actually, I really enjoy a lot of the examples that are drawn out from the report. It's quite, it's not dry, let's put it that way, which I think is always a good thing. So thanks, Richard, and hopefully we'll get you back on the podcast in the not too distant future.
Thanks, Arun. It's great to catch up and great to chat about these trends. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to the PRovoke podcast, brought to you by PRovoke Media and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers.